I never thought I would have to protect myself from the person I spent 20 years building a life with, but one document on my kitchen table made me question everything I believed about my marriage. My name is Michael Anderson, and for most of my adult life, I believed I understood what commitment meant. I believed that if two people worked hard, trusted each other, and shared the same dreams, they could overcome almost anything. My wife Rachel and I had built a comfortable life together in Colorado. We had a home we were proud of, savings we carefully planned for, and a future we thought we both wanted. I owned a small interior design and renovation company, and Rachel worked as a successful real estate consultant. We were not perfect, but we had always been a team. At least, that was what I thought. The first sign that something had changed was so small that I almost ignored it. Rachel started asking more questions about our accounts, our property documents, and the details of our long-term plans. At first, I thought it was a good thing. I assumed she was simply becoming more involved in our financial future. After all, a marriage should be a partnership, and both people should understand what they have built together. But then I noticed something that did not feel right. One evening, I came home earlier than usual after finishing a project meeting. I walked into the kitchen and saw a folder sitting on the table. It was not hidden, and Rachel was not trying to keep it away from me. But something about the documents inside immediately caught my attention. They were related to our assets, our accounts, and plans that I had never seen before. I remember standing there quietly, trying to understand what I was looking at. My first feeling was not anger. It was confusion. How could someone I trusted so completely be making plans that involved our future without talking to me first? I did not know the full story yet. I did not know Rachel's reasons. I did not know whether she was preparing for something temporary or whether she had already made decisions that could change everything we had built together. All I knew was that the person standing beside me for 2 decades suddenly felt like someone I did not fully understand. Looking back, I realized that moment was not really about money. The documents were only the thing I could see. The deeper problem was the distance that had slowly grown between us without either of us admitting it. We had become so focused on work, responsibilities, and daily routines that we stopped asking each other the important questions. We stopped talking about fears, expectations, and the things that kept us awake at night. But at that moment, I was not thinking about all of that. I was thinking about protecting the life I had spent years creating. I needed to understand what was happening before making any decisions. I needed answers from the person I trusted most. And what I discovered next would force me to look at my marriage, my wife, and myself in a completely different way. After finding those documents on our kitchen table, I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I kept telling myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Rachel had always been responsible, and she had never been someone who made careless decisions. I knew the person she was. She was organized, intelligent, and always thinking ahead. That was one of the reasons I respected her. But the more I thought about what I had seen, the more questions started building in my mind. The hardest part was not the paperwork itself. It was the feeling that something important had been happening in my own home without me being part of the conversation. I started paying closer attention to the small changes I had noticed over the previous months. Rachel had become more interested in details about our retirement accounts, property values, and the legal structure of our shared assets. Again, none of those things seemed unusual by themselves. In fact, many couples should have those conversations. The problem was that these conversations felt different. They did not feel like two people planning together. They felt like one person preparing independently. I thought back to the moments when I first noticed the distance between us. There was no single argument that caused it. There was no dramatic event that suddenly changed everything. It happened slowly. We became busy with our own routines. I focused on growing my renovation business, managing employees, and keeping projects on schedule. Rachel spent more time handling her real estate work and managing her own responsibilities. We were both working hard, but somewhere along the way, we stopped checking in with each other the way we used to. I remembered when Rachel and I first bought our home in Colorado. We walked through every room together, talking about how we would build a future there. We made decisions as a team. We planned every expense, every improvement, and every goal together. That was the foundation I believed we still had. That was why the documents bothered me so much. They represented more than financial planning. They represented the possibility that Rachel had started thinking about a future where I was not fully included. I decided not to confront her immediately. I wanted to understand before I reacted. I knew that one emotional conversation could turn into accusations, and I did not want to damage our marriage based on assumptions. So I started gathering information and looking at the situation calmly. I reviewed our financial records, not because I wanted to invade her privacy, but because I needed to understand what was happening with the life we had built together. As I looked deeper, I noticed more signs that Rachel had been thinking about protecting herself. She had asked questions about ownership details and future arrangements that we had never discussed before. Every new discovery created more uncertainty. But it also made me realize something important. This was not just about assets. Money was only the surface. Something had changed between us emotionally, and I needed to find out why. I still loved my wife. I still believed the years we shared mattered. But I could not ignore the feeling that we had reached a moment where pretending everything was normal would only make things worse. I knew the next conversation with Rachel would not be easy. But before I could ask her what was happening, I needed to understand the truth behind the decisions she had been making. I spent several days trying to understand what Rachel was thinking before I finally decided that avoiding the conversation was no longer an option. The more I looked at the situation, the more I realized that the documents were only a small part of a much bigger issue. The real question was not what Rachel had planned. The real question was why she felt the need to make those plans without sharing them with me. That question stayed in my mind because, after 20 years of marriage, I believed we had built a relationship based on honesty. I believed we were the kind of couple who could talk about anything. But the truth was that somewhere along the way, we had stopped having the conversations that mattered most. One evening, after we finished dinner, I noticed Rachel sitting quietly at the table while looking through some notes on her laptop. Normally, I would have asked what she was working on, but this time I hesitated. I did not want to sound suspicious or make her feel like she was being questioned. At the same time, I knew that avoiding the topic would not solve anything. So I decided to start with a simple question. I asked Rachel if she had been thinking about making changes to our financial arrangements. She looked surprised, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. I could see that she understood exactly what I was referring to. Rachel closed her laptop and took a deep breath. She did not immediately become defensive. Instead, she looked tired, almost as if she had been carrying a heavy thought for a long time. She told me that she had been thinking about our future and wanted to make sure she had more clarity about what would happen if life changed unexpectedly. Hearing that answer gave me mixed feelings. Part of me understood the importance of planning. Everyone wants to feel secure about the future. But another part of me felt hurt because those plans involved both of us, yet I felt like I was hearing about them after they were already underway. I asked her why she did not come to me first. That was the question I had been holding inside since the moment I found the documents. Rachel looked down and admitted that she was afraid the conversation would become difficult. She thought I might dismiss her concerns or assume the worst about her intentions. That answer made me pause because I realized something uncomfortable. I had been focused on what Rachel did, but I had not considered what she might have been feeling before she made those decisions. At the same time, I explained that protecting yourself and shutting your spouse out are two very different things. A marriage requires two people to make important decisions together, especially when those decisions affect their shared future. Our conversation did not solve everything that night. There were still unanswered questions and emotions that needed time. But it was the first honest conversation we had about the distance that had grown between us. I began to understand that Rachel was not simply trying to change our financial situation. She was responding to fears she had not shared. And I had to admit that I had also played a role in creating a marriage where those fears remained unspoken. That realization did not erase the hurt I felt, but it changed the way I looked at the situation. For the first time since finding those documents, I felt like I was no longer searching for an enemy. I was trying to understand my wife again. After the conversation Rachel and I had that night, I realized that understanding each other would take more than one honest discussion. We had opened a door that had been closed for a long time, but behind that door were years of feelings, assumptions, and things we had never fully expressed. I knew I could not simply forget what I had discovered, and Rachel knew she could not expect everything to return to normal immediately. We both had to accept that rebuilding trust would require patience and effort from both sides. In the days that followed, I started looking at our situation differently. I still wanted to protect what I had worked for, but I also wanted to understand why my wife had reached a point where she felt she needed to prepare without me. That question became more important than the documents themselves. Rachel and I began talking more openly about the years we had spent together. We discussed moments when we felt supported, but we also talked about moments when we felt alone. It was difficult to admit that even though we lived in the same house, we had sometimes been living separate emotional lives. I had always considered myself a dependable husband. I worked long hours, paid attention to our financial responsibilities, and tried to make sure our family had stability. But Rachel helped me see something I had overlooked. Being responsible did not always mean being emotionally available. I had been so focused on providing security that I did not always notice when she needed reassurance or wanted to be included in deeper conversations about our future. Rachel also admitted that she had made mistakes. She explained that her concerns had grown quietly over time. She worried about unexpected changes in life and wanted to feel prepared. But she understood that making plans without involving me created a different kind of problem. It made me feel like a stranger in decisions that affected both of us. That was the part that hurt the most. It was not about whether Rachel had questions about our finances. It was about feeling excluded from a future that we were supposed to build together. As we continued talking, I realized that we both had been reacting to fears instead of communicating about them. Rachel was afraid of uncertainty. I was afraid of losing trust. Neither of us had intended to create distance, but our choices had slowly created exactly that. I decided that before making any major decisions, I needed to take practical steps to understand our situation clearly. I reviewed our financial plans, organized our records, and made sure I understood the details of everything we had built together. I was not doing this because I wanted to fight against Rachel. I was doing it because responsibility meant being informed. At the same time, I did not want our marriage to become a competition where one person protected themselves from the other. I wanted us to find a way forward where both of us felt secure. The biggest lesson I learned during that period was that trust is not only about believing someone will never disappoint you. Trust is also about creating a relationship where both people feel safe enough to share their concerns before they become bigger problems. Rachel and I had reached a difficult moment, but we were finally having the conversations we should have had years earlier. And as I learned more about what was happening, I began to realize that the situation was not only about protecting what we owned. It was about understanding what we were at risk of losing. As Rachel and I continued having conversations about our marriage and our future, I started to understand that the situation had become much bigger than a disagreement about financial decisions. The documents that first made me question everything were only a reflection of problems that had been growing quietly for years. We were not just dealing with questions about ownership or planning. We were dealing with the emotional distance that had formed between two people who once felt completely connected. One evening, Rachel and I sat together in our living room and decided to talk about something we had avoided for a long time. We talked about when we first noticed things changing between us. Neither of us could point to one specific moment because there was not one. It happened slowly through busy schedules, unfinished conversations, and assumptions we made about each other. I assumed Rachel knew how much I cared because I worked hard for our future. Rachel assumed I understood her worries because I was responsible for our finances. The truth was that we were both making assumptions instead of asking questions. Rachel told me that she had started feeling uncertain about the future years before I noticed anything different. She explained that watching me handle so many responsibilities sometimes made her feel like she was standing beside my plans instead of building them with me. Hearing that was difficult because my intention had always been to create security for both of us. I never wanted her to feel excluded. But I realized that good intentions do not always create the results we expect. I also shared my side of the story. I told Rachel that finding those documents without knowing about them made me feel like I was no longer her partner in important decisions. I explained that I did not need to control every choice, but I needed to feel that we were facing important moments together. That conversation changed something between us. For the first time in a long time, we were not defending our own positions. We were trying to understand each other. I began to see that Rachel was not simply trying to protect herself from me. She was trying to find a sense of security because she felt uncertain. At the same time, Rachel began to understand why her actions had affected me so deeply. She realized that even if her intentions were not negative, making major plans without involving me damaged the trust between us. We agreed that moving forward would require honesty from both sides. We decided that financial decisions would no longer be something one person handled alone. We would review our plans together, discuss our concerns openly, and make sure both of us felt heard. It was not an overnight solution. We still had moments when old emotions returned. There were times when I remembered the shock of finding those documents, and there were times when Rachel worried that I still saw her through that moment. But slowly, we started replacing fear with communication. I learned that protecting my future was not about preparing for the worst possible outcome. It was about creating a relationship where both people could be honest before problems became bigger. Rachel learned that independence within a marriage does not mean leaving the other person outside important decisions. It means bringing your thoughts, concerns, and hopes into the relationship. For years, I believed the strongest marriages were built by avoiding major problems. Now I understand they are built by facing those problems together. The hardest conversations we had were also the conversations that helped us find each other again. After the conversations Rachel and I had, I realized that rebuilding trust would require more than understanding what happened. Understanding was only the first step. The next challenge was learning how to create a relationship where both of us felt secure, respected, and included. For a long time, we had focused on managing our responsibilities, but we had forgotten that a strong marriage also requires attention, patience, and emotional connection. I began to notice that the biggest changes were happening in small moments. Rachel and I started talking more often about things we normally would have kept to ourselves. We discussed our concerns about the future, our expectations, and the things that made us feel uncertain. These conversations were not always comfortable, but they helped us understand each other in a way we had not done for years. I learned more about Rachel's fears, and she learned more about mine. One of the most important things Rachel shared with me was that she never wanted our situation to become a conflict between us. She explained that her actions came from feeling uncertain about the future, not from wanting to hurt me or remove me from our life together. Hearing that did not erase the impact of what happened, but it helped me see the difference between intention and result. Someone can make a decision with one purpose and still create a completely different effect on another person. I also had to be honest with myself. I had spent years believing that providing stability was the same as providing connection. I worked hard, handled responsibilities, and tried to make sure we were financially prepared. But I realized that Rachel did not only need a husband who planned for the future. She needed a husband who was present during the process of building that future. That was a difficult lesson for me because I had always viewed my efforts as proof that I cared. I had to understand that love is not only shown through actions we believe are important. It is also shown through the moments when we stop and ask the other person what they need. Rachel and I decided to create a different approach to our finances and our relationship. We began reviewing important decisions together. We set aside time to discuss plans instead of waiting until something became a problem. We wanted our home to become a place where both of us felt comfortable sharing concerns before they turned into bigger issues. The changes were not immediate. There were still moments when trust felt fragile. Sometimes a simple conversation about finances could bring back memories of that difficult period. But instead of avoiding those feelings, we learned how to talk through them. That was the difference. Before, we had tried to protect ourselves from discomfort. Now, we were learning how to support each other through it. Looking back, I understand that the situation changed the way I viewed partnership. I used to think protecting my future meant making sure everything I worked for was safe. Now I understand that protecting my future also means protecting the relationship with the person I chose to share it with. Rachel and I were not rebuilding because we wanted to pretend nothing happened. We were rebuilding because we finally understood what needed to change. The experience showed us that trust is not something created once and guaranteed forever. It is something two people continue building through honesty, communication, and everyday choices. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like Rachel and I were not just living together. We were truly moving forward together. As Rachel and I continued rebuilding our relationship, I started to understand that the hardest part of our journey was not the original discovery. The hardest part was accepting that both of us had contributed to the distance that had grown between us. It would have been easier to focus only on what Rachel had done and ignore everything else. But if we wanted our marriage to become stronger, we needed to look honestly at the choices we had both made over the years. I began reflecting on how our lives had changed. When we first got married, every decision felt like something we made together. We talked about everything, from small purchases to major life goals. We were curious about each other's thoughts and excited about building a future side by side. But as time passed, responsibilities increased, and our routines became more complicated. We became comfortable, and that comfort slowly turned into distance. We were still a family, but we were no longer connecting the way we used to. The situation involving our assets exposed something we had ignored for too long. It showed us that financial decisions were not the real problem. The real problem was that we had stopped making decisions together. Rachel and I had both allowed assumptions to replace conversations. I assumed she understood my intentions because I worked hard for our future. She assumed I understood her worries because I was always focused on planning ahead. We were both trying to do what we thought was right, but we were doing it separately. One evening, Rachel and I sat outside on our back porch and talked about what we wanted our future to look like. It was not a conversation about documents or accounts. It was a conversation about us. We talked about the kind of relationship we wanted to have 5 or 10 years from that moment. We talked about trust, partnership, and what it meant to feel like a team again. Rachel admitted that she had been afraid of uncertainty. She had spent years watching life change unexpectedly for people around us, and she wanted to make sure she felt prepared. I told her I understood that desire, but I also needed her to understand that preparation should not create separation between us. We both agreed that security should come from working together, not from creating plans independently. That conversation became a turning point because it changed the way we approached disagreements. Before, we often tried to solve problems by proving our own perspectives were reasonable. Now, we tried to understand the emotions behind those perspectives. Instead of asking, who is right, we started asking, what are we both trying to protect? That simple change made a huge difference. I also realized that trust is not only built during moments of happiness. It is built when two people choose honesty during uncomfortable moments. Anyone can communicate when life is easy. The real test comes when fear, uncertainty, and disappointment appear. Rachel and I were learning how to face those moments together instead of allowing them to create more distance. The experience changed my understanding of marriage. I used to believe that a strong relationship was one without serious problems. Now I believe a strong relationship is one where two people are willing to work through problems with patience and respect. We were not the same couple we were before everything happened. In some ways, we became better because we finally started paying attention to the things we had ignored. We learned that protecting our future was not only about planning financially. It was about protecting the trust and connection that made that future meaningful. Over the following months, Rachel and I continued working on the changes we had started making. I learned that rebuilding trust was not about one perfect conversation or one promise that everything would be different. It was about the choices we made every day. Small actions became the foundation of our progress. The way we communicated, the way we included each other in decisions, and the way we handled difficult topics all became reminders that we were choosing to move forward together. One of the biggest changes was how we approached our finances. Before everything happened, money was something we managed, but it was not something we always discussed deeply. We paid bills, planned expenses, and saved for the future, but we rarely talked about what those things represented emotionally. We never really asked each other what security meant to us. I believed security came from preparation and stability. Rachel believed security came from knowing she would be prepared for unexpected changes. Neither of us was wrong, but we had been looking at the same issue from completely different perspectives. Once we understood that, our conversations became easier. We started setting aside time every month to review our goals and talk about upcoming decisions. These meetings were not about checking on each other or creating rules. They were about making sure both of us felt involved. Rachel wanted to know that her voice mattered, and I wanted to know that I was still a trusted partner in our future. That balance changed the way we viewed teamwork. I also noticed changes in the way Rachel and I handled emotional conversations. Before, if something bothered one of us, we sometimes waited until the issue became too difficult to ignore. We thought avoiding discomfort would keep the peace, but we eventually learned that silence does not create peace. It only delays important conversations. Now, when something feels uncertain, we talk about it earlier. We do not always agree immediately, but we have learned that disagreement does not have to create distance. It can actually create understanding when both people are willing to listen. Rachel also helped me recognize something about myself. I had always been proud of being independent and responsible. Those qualities helped me build my business and provide stability for our family. But I realized that independence can become a weakness when it prevents someone from accepting support. I did not have to carry every responsibility alone. A marriage is not about one person protecting everything while the other person simply follows along. It is about two people sharing the weight of life together. Rachel had a similar realization. She understood that protecting herself did not mean keeping important thoughts separate from me. True security came from knowing she could express her concerns and still feel respected. We both had to let go of old habits and create new ones. Looking back, I can see that the difficult moment we experienced forced us to have conversations we might have avoided forever. It showed us where we were disconnected and gave us a chance to repair those areas before they became permanent. Our marriage did not become stronger because we avoided problems. It became stronger because we finally learned how to face them together. The experience changed the way I define commitment. Commitment is not only staying when everything feels easy. It is choosing each other when life becomes complicated. Rachel and I were learning that a future built together requires more than shared possessions or shared responsibilities. It requires shared trust, shared honesty, and the willingness to keep choosing the same team. When I look back at everything that happened between Rachel and me, I realize that the most important lesson was not about protecting what we owned. It was about understanding what we were building together. For a long time, I believed that a secure future came from careful planning, financial stability, and making sure everything was organized. Those things are important, but I learned that a truly secure future also depends on trust, communication, and the connection between two people. The moment I found those documents changed the way I saw my marriage. At first, I thought I was facing a problem with assets and decisions. I thought the biggest challenge was figuring out how to protect everything I had worked for. But as time passed, I realized the real challenge was protecting the relationship that gave meaning to everything we had built. Rachel and I had spent 2 decades creating a life together. We had shared achievements, challenges, and countless ordinary moments that became important memories. The difficult period we experienced did not erase those years. Instead, it showed us that even a strong relationship requires attention and care. One of the biggest changes was learning that trust is not something you simply have because you are married. Trust is something you continue creating through your actions. It is built when you include someone in important decisions. It is strengthened when you listen before making assumptions. It grows when both people feel safe enough to express their concerns honestly. Rachel and I had both forgotten that lesson for a while. We had become so focused on handling our own responsibilities that we stopped sharing the thoughts and fears behind those responsibilities. Today, our approach is different. We still plan carefully for the future. We still think about finances, responsibilities, and the goals we want to achieve. But now we approach those things as partners. We do not see conversations about money as stressful obligations. We see them as opportunities to understand each other better. The biggest change was not the way we managed our assets. The biggest change was the way we managed our relationship. I also learned something important about conflict. A difficult moment does not automatically mean a relationship is broken. Sometimes, a difficult moment reveals the areas that need attention. It can show two people what they have been avoiding and give them the opportunity to make better choices. Rachel and I could have allowed that experience to create permanent distance between us. We could have focused only on who was right and who was wrong. Instead, we chose to understand each other. That choice did not happen because everything suddenly became easy. It happened because we both decided that our marriage was worth the effort. If I could speak to myself on the day I discovered those documents, I would tell myself that the fear I felt was only the beginning of a much bigger lesson. I thought I was losing control of my future, but I was actually being given a chance to rebuild it in a better way. I learned that protecting your future is not only about protecting your possessions. It is about protecting the trust, respect, and partnership that allow two people to create a meaningful life together. Rachel and I are not the same couple we were before that difficult chapter. We are more honest, more aware, and more intentional about choosing each other. And that is the greatest thing we gained from a moment that once felt like it could take everything away.